story of the Cathedral of the Holy Spirit is one of perseverance. In 1917, Bishop Worley began purchasing land in West Bismarck as a site for the future cathedral, and it would take almost 10 years to acquire the whole block. The Great Depression and severe drought postponed the construction, forced many farmers into bankruptcy, and caused many to leave the state. The original design resembled the Abbey in Richardson. It was to be constructed in brick with a stone foundation. Long delays forced changes to the design, and the field stones that were brought to the site in 1922 laid there for 20 years. Bishop Worley's desire for a grand cathedral to adorn the rapidly growing capital of North Dakota would stand the test of time. Thanks to a period of bountiful harvests in the late 1930s and early 1940s, his plan for a distinctive and enduring shrine to the Holy Spirit would receive new life. Ground was broken in 1941, less than 2 months before the death of retired Bishop Worley, and construction finally commenced under the direction of Jim Guthrie.
And Bishop Ryan came in and became fast friends. It was an Irish connection. Bishop Ryan was from Fargo, and he came out here to be the bishop here. And the plans were already in the works, and so Bishop Ryan finalized those plans and then worked with my grandfather to build the new cathedral.
Yet as world events unfolded, the cathedral was to be built in the shadow of war.
I was lucky enough to have my dad was Peter Hartwick, who worked for Jim Guthrie in building the cathedral. And so being that the war was starting, and a lot of the young guys were joining the service and everything like that, it ended up that he had a pretty old crew that whole time. My dad was over 50 at the time, and he'd come over from Norway actually, so probably wasn't getting a service anyhow, I don't know. But anyhow, he was in his 50s, and all the other workers were at least that old, if not older. Some of them were probably 70s.
At the beginning of the project, workers were paid $26 a week. And if the foreman was pleased with their work, he would give them a 15-cent an hour raise. A house that stood on the construction site had to be moved in 1941, and to this day can be found on the corner of Hannafin and Avenue A. There were also very practical reasons for using concrete. Bishop Ryan believed concrete was the best material for the cathedral and personally made a trip to Montana to inspect how concrete buildings there were standing up against the extremes of weather, particularly the cold. The new cathedral was modeled after Immaculate Conception Church in Butte, also made of monolithic concrete.
The prototype was the bishop's house. That was the kind of the test, because they had no experience of building something as big as the cathedral in concrete. So the bishop's house was kind of the test case for that, and then they learned a lot about how building that, and then moved on to the cathedral.
The concrete for the building was not considered necessary for the war effort. Much of the concrete was poured by hand with the use of wheelbarrows and ramps. Not all materials were hoisted to the top of the forms by the block and tackle pulley system. Adam Mathern, who worked for Guthrie Construction, remembered that sometimes they would tie a line to the front part of the wheelbarrow and have somebody help pull as it was pushed. One time, one of the workers somehow let go of the line, and the fellow in the back of the wheelbarrow lost control. The whole thing crashed about 25 feet down and then ended in the basement. Nobody got hurt, but the wheelbarrow suffered. 7 older men worked on the construction crew with the help of teenage boys during the summers and school vacation. To give the building its structural integrity, they had to pour concrete year-round, working in the heat of summer and the bitter cold of winter. The Holy Spirit was behind this project from the start. Pete was walking on top of the wall way up in the air, as he often did, Mathern recalled, pointing out that Hartwick wasn't at all afraid of heights. And then the wind blew or something, and Pete slipped and was only saved when one of the loops on his pants caught a piece of steel rod sticking out of the cement. There Pete was, 30 feet up in the air, hanging over the side with part of his pants saving him. Mathern said that the workforce didn't know what to call the incident at that time, but in later years it was, at least in his mind, a moment of divine intervention. While concrete wasn't necessary for the war effort, steel certainly was. Steel roof beams were shipped to Bismarck before the war and spent most of the war hidden in the tall grass of a slough behind the construction site.
It was during a war, so they had a hard time getting a hold of some of these materials, especially steel, rebar for the concrete, but then also the big question was, what are we going to do when we have to put on the roof? They were able to procure steel for the roof, joists and whatever was needed up there. And of course, the Army was requisitioning all that material, so the big question was, where are you going to get, what are you going to do? We'll figure it out when we get there. But they already had it stashed away. It was already purchased, and they hid it. And then when they got to that point, they brought it out. And by that point, it was a little later in the war, too, that I think it was a little bit more acceptable. So they did things, you know, just, and it was pretty amazing that they got that thing done.
The building got done just about the time the war was ending. And so there was Europe had, you know, they had invaded Europe, Normandy, and that was 1945 when the church was completed. And my dad, like I say, came from Norway, and it took him a long time to learn English. He never did learn all the spelling and pronunciations. But he wrote something in the thing up there besides his name, and I couldn't read it. I was up there with some other guys replacing windows, probably about 20 years ago. So it's the most recent, that's the last time I was up there. But anyhow, I couldn't read it. And I showed it to my brother. My brother was in Minneapolis, and he came home, and I said, "What does this say?" And he read it just like that, and I tried so hard. And it says what it said, but he spelled the stuff wrong. Invasion of Europe.
The cathedral finally opened with a simple blessing and a solemn pontifical high mass celebrated by Bishop Ryan on August 30th, 1945. Finally, almost 30 years after land was purchased, Bishop Worley's dream of a grand cathedral on the prairie was complete.